Hi, and welcome to the Three Things I Know podcast from the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. I'm Alex Mortimer, the Research Engagement Manager. The school has over 150 members of academic research and teaching staff across 4 departments and institutes. And at King's as a whole, we have one of the biggest concentrations reaching out into other departments like war studies, the business school. We have one of the biggest concentrations of political scientists, political theorists, and economists of various kinds in the UK. And this is a little podcast where I talk to my colleagues, as many of my colleagues as possible, and I ask them, what are the things you wish policymakers knew? And I'm using policymakers very broadly. It could be just people working in the policy world. It could be journalists interested in particular questions, all of those sorts of people. Now, Dr. Mona Morgan-Collins is lecturer in gender and political economy in the Department of Political Economy. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
First of all, do you want to tell me how you've arrived at the research that you do now? So what's your trajectory been?
Well, it was actually quite unusual because I started being interested in electoral systems during my undergraduate degrees. And a lot of people do undergraduate degrees in something else, and then they move to politics, or vice versa. But for me, it was like I was hooked year one. When I learned about what electoral systems can do. It's like, oh my God, are you serious that electoral system can determine who wins the elections? And what are the policies that are going to affect my life? And so, from that point, once I learned this, I was hooked. I was hooked on political science, but of course, it took several years, if not a decade, until I finished, all of the studies and started researching politics. But somehow, throughout that research journey of mine, I became interested in gender. I was like, oh, well, this is all interesting, but what about women? And I also became very interested in history, using historical data, using econometrics, but asking using historical data is such a wonderful thing for me or for anyone really to do because mostly we have been thinking of history as using qualitative data, yet especially around the early 20th century, 19th century, there's so much data, quantitative data that has not really been explored. And so for a political scientist who's interested in the big questions of today, having this huge data that goes span 150 years back, that's like, it's again, I'm hooked, I want to study this. And then I somehow put all of this together, so it became a research interest in electoral systems, historical data, and women.
So electoral systems, and we're going to be talking about PR, proportional representation in particular. And as you know, there's a section of the UK political sphere, I mean, in all countries, but in the UK political sphere, there's definitely a set of people who are PR nerds who know a lot about this. And I count some of these people as my personal friends. I'm probably not a PR nerd. I'm just in a sort of a larger group, broadly know the arguments, broadly in favor, but not sort of don't have detailed knowledge. But my assumption, and probably the assumption of all people, who are in my position, is basically PR increases turnout. So that's my kind of starting assumption. Is that actually the case for a start?
There's a big debate on it among political scientists. And you're right that, the political scientists like you and your friends kind of assume, oh, this is going to work. This is going to increase turnout. This is good for democracy because of that. At the same time, some of the research is a bit more well, we're not so sure. Maybe this is more mixed. So not every paper on this issue that's been published concludes clearly, hey, very clearly, this is going to boost turnout. We should all adopt PR. At the same time, there has been a very profoundly influential paper recently published in one of the top political science journals that is finally, I believe, came up with a fairly, clear explanation for these for this intuition that probably it boosts turnout, but maybe not in every case. And what these colleagues are arguing is that it has actually to do with pre-existing political competition. So if you're switching from single member districts to PR, overall, you may find that this increases turnout. But the increase in turnout won't happen equally so in all constituencies. Of course, if you have a really uncompetitive race, where, imagine, U.S. South, 100 years ago, or, something like that, where sometimes it's even uncontested at this time period, but, sometimes the second candidate gets like 5% of the vote. Of course, the turnout's going to be really, really, really low because, well, your vote will not really change anything. And the opposing party will not really, or the opposition party will not really want to mobilize in that constituency either. So no one has an incentive to really do anything. So the turnout is really low in this constituency. And then you adopt PR. And suddenly it's like, oh, I can get represented even though if I get 5% of the vote. So of course I'm going to be trying to mobilize so that I get those 5% of the vote and I get that seat in a legislature. So in those type of constituencies, the effect of PR will be huge. But of course, you will also have the constituencies where turnout was fairly competitive. Like you think of swing constituencies in the UK and the US, the turnout is so spiked up. So, everyone's really thinking, oh, maybe my vote will decide elections. Everyone's really thinking, if I don't vote, maybe I'm going to lose out. And the same thing goes for parties. The parties suddenly start saying, well, if we don't mobilize in this constituency, we're going to lose very easy constituency, easy seat. And so in those places, actually, what this new research shows, empirically and theoretically, it's very plausible as well, is that in those super highly competitive places, turnout may actually even fall after adoption of PR because you don't get that huge, yes, PR is more competitive. It's going to be more encouraging of turnout, both parties to mobilize and people to vote. But if it's like so spiked up, then, the PR is not going to hold up to that. So in those places, turnout may actually fall. And so the overall effect of PR may really depend on how many of those super competitive places you have and how many of those super uncompetitive places you have. And if you have a situation where no one really votes, whether that's just election that normally doesn't attract people to vote, or like local elections or regional elections or European elections, or if you have a situation where just no one's really all of the districts are highly uncompetitive, then in those places, in those contexts, PR will have a profound and implement profound change on who will be voting and who will be mobilizing. Maybe let me say that again because there was too much difficulties, but the key message is that there will be some contexts where PR will have huge effect. And there will be some context in some countries or in some type of elections where actually things were really competitive before, things were really highly, mobilized by parties and very highly attended by voters at the polls. And in those contexts, PR really won't change much and actually can even lower turnout.
That's really fascinating. I mean, you can see it. You can see it definitely how the drivers of that might include the fact that, I mean, this would change this changes the game for political parties, doesn't it? Locally and nationally. And can you imagine actually supposing PR was implemented in the UK tomorrow, somehow magically, how campaigning would look different over the next year? It would be an absolute scramble to throw resources into different places. And those kind of very competitive bellwether constituencies that now get all the attention. Yeah, you can see definitely how the resources would simply even out, wouldn't they? And that would have to have an effect. But let's go back to what you said, you mentioned in there, who's doing this voting, who is doing this more or less voting. So I know you work on so gender in elections. So who are the mobilized voters in cases where PR increases turnout? Are they, what is the kind of the gender's pattern here?
It's a really insightful and good question because for most of the time, researchers are just interested in the overall effects, like, oh, we're going to get higher turnout. But, well, who are going to be the new voters attracted to this, right? And so, thinking about this is, I think, really important because, for example, we know that if you force people to vote, let's say you start implementing some type of compulsory voting, or you start fining people, giving fines to people who don't vote, or at least nominally so, then turnout suddenly goes up. And of course, you're mobilizing those who are mostly sort of socioeconomically disadvantaged normally wouldn't vote because now they have even a greater incentive to vote under the threat. So we do know that turnout, if it increases, it starts drawing, from the under mobilized groups. But it's not just the case of increasing turnout by mobilizing the poorest sections more undermobilized. It's any group that's otherwise undermobilized. So I think I'm mostly interested in the question of what about the effect of PR on women's turnout? Because we assume somehow that women's turnout has leveled up with men's turnout, and therefore this is an old question and we no longer need to worry about it, other than, oh, women are now voting more often than men. So, but actually, that's very rare time wise, it's very rare context, geographically, spatial wise. What we do see is that A, through history, this hasn't been the case. And B, where the gap in turnout between women and men has closed, or even reversed, it's a very specific context of the most salient elections in few Western, mostly Western or broadly OECD countries. Rest of the world, this is not always the case. And often you see very huge percentage point gaps between women's and men's turnout. And also, even if you go, let's say, in the UK or the European Union countries, at the lower level, less salient elections, that's where you also find gaps.
So
So,
local elections, European Parliament,
so
those, yeah.
even in the West, even today, the gaps have not really been closed. So we tend to dismiss this as, oh, well, I'm not really interested in women's turnout anymore, but actually, we should continue to try to understand what happens here, and especially so in the places where women's turnout is hugely discouraged, or through history, the time period that I study, and one of the reasons why I study this time period is that the barriers that women faced to voting were really huge. So if
Mm,
you have new voters who have been listening to 20 years long debates of how they're unsuited to politics and how they should stay home because that's where they belong, and they should delegate their engagement in public sphere to the men who simply know better.
right.
And so you're socialized in this. You're socialized in an environment where your mother haven't voted, didn't vote, on all of that. So the social barrier, the cultural barrier for you to say, oh no, I know as much, and my vote matters, and I will go to the polls. It's huge. But there's also a barrier of what I would sort of say more structural, which is, well, if most women are staying home, then how are you going to deal with childcare? How are you going to, navigate this? But there's also a structural barrier in terms of if most women are home and they're not working, you're losing out on the benefits that we know employment, full-time employment provides. So most men benefit from, let's say, at this time period that I'm studying, but a lot of it is generalizable in various ways to different contexts. Most men are benefiting from, let's say, mobilization through trade unions, or you chat with your colleague, and then mobilizes you. So, well, if women are not at work, what's the main? How do they, become? Where's the social pressure for them to vote that mobilizes men? Where's the trade union knocking on their door and saying, we really want you to vote? And so, in the context where these barriers are so severe, that women are, having really hard time to get the same access to political resources that eventually mobilize them, then can institution help to close the gap between
Such as PR. I
such as
see.
here?
So tell me about the actual cases you looked at, because obviously we're talking about, yeah, historical data, really only about 100 years or a little bit more of that history. So what are your kind of your data points or your case studies?
It's Norway, Sweden, New Zealand, US a little bit, and Austria. And those are, it's a very mixed case of basically through two countries with single members, just two countries with PR. One country switched, which is really nice. Norway
Mhm.
adopted PR shortly after women's suffrage, and all of those cases are sort of among the first countries who enfranchised women in the first suffrage wave, or around World War One, mostly before. So this is a time period where suffrage was still really a novelty. Women were really facing these huge structural, but also social, cultural barriers to voting. But then again, this is not just about what happened back then. This is about, well, this is a context where we know there are these huge differences between women and men's probability of voting based on these socioeconomic and other cultural disadvantages and inequality. So can, in this case of the worst case conditions, PR help? And that's something that you could then, if you can figure that one out with this
Hmm.
historical data, then you can start saying, oh, today, in the contexts where women are discouraged from voting, we would expect PR to help as well.
So if you can make it work here, in theory, you can potentially make it work anywhere, which is
Exactly.
exciting. So what did you find?
Well, it's not that simple. I know it's
Of
not that
course.
simple, right? So, in general, yes, PR can help. But actually, I have two separate papers on this, and both are very critical. So, this is a very odd situation where I am on the proponent side of PR, but yet at the same time, I publish these papers of saying, yeah, but. So one of the buts is that I have published recently in American Political Science Review, and where I demonstrate using the case of Norway very clearly that actually whether or not the gap between women's and turnout will close again depends on the pre-existing political competition. So this what I talked about at the beginning kind of is an argument that extends to the turnout difference between women men and as well. So if you think about the hugely uncompetitive single member district, then this is a place where the gap between women's and men's turnout is going to also be really huge. It's going to be mostly the men who are, voting because let's imagine a district with only 15% of the population voting. Most of them will be men. So the gap between women and men is huge in that point. And if at that point you're if it's hugely uncompetitive, then this is going to be precisely the point where you're more likely to mobilize more men than women and therefore start closing the gap. And I have already said something that I need to correct. So let's rewind back because I think I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be. Actually, so let me give you an example of this. If you have a district that's fairly uncompetitive, but let's say 50% of the population votes in that district, most of the people who are voting are probably going to be men because the turnout is fairly low. Most of the people who are voting are men. So at that point, if you start mobilizing more through this incentivization structure through parties and both voters, you're going to be bringing up more women.
Right.
So it's very important, basically, that you have uncompetitive elections with moderate turnout, that this is precisely the context in which you start mobilizing more women than men, because the women are those who are not
So they're
mobilized.
not the mobilized political group. Men are the mobilized political group by default. So they are the ones voting in low turnout elections.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what you need, so in a context, for example, in New Zealand that I studied, there the elections were hugely competitive. And at those points, the gender gap between women and men was really, really small. And this is really fascinating because New Zealand was the first country adopting this way before anyone else.
When
And
did they adopt female suffrage?
1892, you have I would need to go back to revise.
Let's say early 1890s. That's, yeah.
Yeah. So let me verify this, but it's the 90s, 1890s. But anyway, the point is that this is the point. This is the time where not only women are first to vote in the world at the country level, but also there continue to these huge barriers. And yet you have almost no to few percentage point turnout gaps. This is better than what we see in a lot of countries today.
Yeah.
So what happened there? Well, the elections were super competitive for various reasons. And at that point, you're mobilizing most of the population, and you're bringing up most of the undermobilized women electorate together with it. So if you implement PR at that time, at that point, it wouldn't have made much of a difference because women were already voting because the elections were so competitive and the turnout of men was already so high. If you have a situation where this is not the case, like for example in Norway, where you introduce PR after some elections were competitive prior to that, and some districts were not so competitive, then yeah, you're starting to close the gap in the non-competitive elections. But in the districts that were previously competitive, actually we see exactly that. turnout's going down or is staying the same. And in those places, there's no change or worsening of the gender turnout gap.
So basically, you find historically exactly what the paper that you referred to at the beginning finds in what I presume was a contemporary context. I presume that paper was looking at contemporary data or not.
So these are both historical papers. What I'm adding to it is that it's pretty much an insight that works for the gender turnout gap as well,
Right.
not just overall turnout. And theoretical insight I am developing in the papers is really to say, look, PR will increase women's turnout, but whether or not it increases, it narrows the difference between women's and men's turnout is gonna depend on context.
Mhm.
One of the contexts is that you already have to have most men mobilized.
Mm.
Because if PR is bringing up more voters, then you want that to happen from the undermobilized
Yeah.
section, would be women. So you need to have, you need, I'm, I'm actually talking about the second condition under which PR
Right. Okay.
increases.
So there's,
I
yeah.
have
So
sort
the
of
first
blended
condition we've
one
done. Yeah.
condition to the other. But the first condition, just to clarify, the first condition is that you need to have basically uncompetitive races
Yeah.
prior to the term, because if it doesn't change overall turnout, then, or it even decreases overall turnout or men's turnout especially, then you wouldn't expect much of an
No.
effect on women's gender turnout gap in general. And but then there's the second condition that I need to now clarify, that I have that's just been published, just been accepted for publication in British Journal of Political Science. And there I show that what I started talking about in a minute ago is that what you need, the second condition under which PR will start narrowing the gender turnout gap, is that you're precisely having at least most men already mobilized prior to the reform. Because if you're in a context where most men don't vote, this could be because the election is super uninteresting, like in local elections, no one really wants to vote, for example, in some cases, or you're in a context where the election is so hugely uncompetitive that really, no one really wants to vote anyway, even in salient elections. If you start bringing up more new voters to the polls because of the change of strategic incentivization through the new institutions of proportional representation, you're gonna, if no one votes you, who you're gonna be mobilizing, you're gonna start with the men who are already more likely to vote because they are
Mm.
not facing the barriers. So if you're a party thinking about who am I going to mobilize here, you could mobilize a man who's unlikely to vote, but not as unlikely to vote as a woman. So you're more likely to target the undermobilized man before you start targeting the undermobilized
Right.
women. In
So
the
they're simply
context,
lower hanging fruit, aren't they, in terms of where a party puts its resources in those contexts?
exactly, absolutely. So yes, PR will narrow the gender turnout gap, but
Mm.
only in contexts where most men have already been mobilized. If you assume that women are facing those barriers, right? If women are not facing barriers and they're equally likely to vote, then we're not there's no gender turnout gap to close. So of course PR is not going to change much. But if you're in
Right.
the context of the worst conditions or really bad conditions for women, where women are less likely to vote, facing these barriers, then parties know it. So they will only mobilize them if they really need to, because there's high competition either through PR or single member districts, and they will only do it if, well, we will pay the higher cost of mobilizing the women, but it's only in a context where we need to get more votes, but most cheaper, what quote cheaper men are already mobilized.
Right.
So those are the two conditions under which PR will narrow the gender turnout gap. And it in most cases that's what will happen. In most cases, if you look at countries with single member districts today, you will find a lot of uncompetitive races, and you will find fairly high turnout among men. So it's fairly generalizable. Yes, overall, you would expect PR to close the gender turnout gap. However, it will not always be the case. You change from salient elections to elections that are very uninteresting. And at that point, no, you're actually, you're going to be increasing the difference between women's and men's turnout, because you're going to be mobilizing in that context more men than you're mobilizing women. Right.
So
So
I see.
actually,
Right.
it's the opposite.
I see. I hadn't actually followed that bit. Okay, so not only so just as in the general population, the turnout may go down, the gender gap may widen within that if you've
Exactly.
got previously competitive districts.
Exactly.
So right,
Local elections where nobody votes, you really don't want to adopt PR in this particular aspect of it, right? So, I mean, there are
right,
other benefits of PR, but if you're just thinking about gender turnout gap, you might actually overmobilize men to a greater extent than it was before.
right.
Um, and then the second thing is that it's not just the saliency of elections, but there could also be contexts where the election is just really competitive already. So in those contexts, in those parts of those countries, or if it refers to entire country, like for example, the New Zealand case I was talking about, again, you're not going to get much of a difference. And you
Mm.
may even get a reversal. So if, every single contest is really, really, really competitive, actually, you might just, again, start over mobilize, start demobilizing more women than men, therefore increasing the gap between the two.
Mm.
So yes, PR helps. In most cases, it should. There are plenty of benefits of PR. There are some disadvantages, but that's where the debate is. But when it comes to women's turnout, especially with respect to men's turnout, there's that but. Yes, it will, but not always.
And this is what's really fascinating to me is that you've used, I mean, I love this, you've used historical data to effectively to basically kind of mirror or suggest some conditions that are currently in point in some countries now. So you've kind of, as you, I love it, I like this characterization of it as a worst case scenario. That what you've said here is that actually this is a bit of a, well, as you say, it's just a bit of a cautionary tale, isn't it? That this won't always work in the obvious way that you think it will. So the answer to my, and I just love that you've used the historical data to show that, and it kind of underlines the value of doing this. But that just happens to be, yeah, my kind of my own hobby horse on these things. So yeah, so the answer to my question, my initial question, as a kind of a broadly informed but not kind of like expertly informed person, my question was, does PR always increase turnout? And your answer is, it depends, which is a completely fair answer. And I've really enjoyed listening to you outline the conditions on which it depends. So thank you very much for this, Rana, and we will hopefully talk again soon.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex.